Talking about stress, if you cause it, you should at least have something to say about it. Good afternoon to you. And how are you doing out there? Great. You are looking really laid back and relaxed, totally stress-free, which of course is why you are here. Listen, let me just warn you before we go anywhere in our time together that I am, at the best of times, a pretty lazy preacher. So any excuse I have for getting other people to work, I grab it. That's just a little warning to tell you that you need to stay at least half awake, because I might need you to help me do some work. And in fact, I thought I'd get Trisha to help me do some work as well, because as we were exchanging anecdotes a little while ago, such spurious stories about being late for broadcasting and such like that, I was actually hearing that you have some experience in counseling. You did a little bit of training somewhere in counseling?
That's right, yeah.
Like where?
About 15, 16 years ago, I did some studies with St. John's College, Nottingham, by extension, on pastoral care and counselling. And I've carried on in the intervening years doing bereavement counselling and helping hurting marriages.
Yeah. Of which there are many these days. And this week you are also working a little...
yes, looking after the Pastoral Care Centre with a team of folk who are trained and willing to help.
Yeah. So we're going to spend some time talking about coping with stress. But we were just wondering in our conversation a little earlier on about maybe some of the things which actually causes stress. I mean, in terms of your work, would you have a benchmark, a little list of things which seem to crop up quite often in stresses?
Yes, I think you've probably all noticed somewhere, back of the Reader's Digest or in the daily paper or something, there is a recognised list, isn't there, of a stress table, probably somewhere at the top there's moving house, having babies, divorce, bereavement. You know, there are many big-ish issues, isn't there, that come fairly high up the stress ladder. But for a lot of folk too, it's not just one thing, is it? It's often a combination.
Yeah, and if you were to say, here are the 2 or 3 top things which you feel keeps coming back. I mean, is it money? Is it kids? Is it, you know, what would you say would be the really key things which keeps recurring?
Amongst the people that I particularly work with and see, they are at the stage where they are perhaps quite recently married, children have come along, and perhaps going through a divorce situation. So I would think many of them are very closely family-related issues.
Yeah. And it was interesting, you know, I used to work with, in the church I pastored for a while, there was a young woman who worked with the ambulance services. And she told me something I never really twigged, but she said that one of the most stressful time in the whole calendar year was Christmas.
Right.
Yeah, because families are actually thrown together. That would sort of bear out some of the things you're saying there.
It can work both ways, can't it? It can be because you're there with the family that you hardly see for the rest of the year and you're supposedly having a good time and you've got to get on. Or it can be that you're incredibly lonely because everyone else seems to have family and you don't.
Yeah, so stress can actually come from the people you're sometimes closest with. Tell me, the last thing, Tricia, before you sit down, are Christians good at, I mean, are we better at handling stress than others, or, you know, or worse, or about the same as everybody else, would you say?
I think it's very, very closely linked with our own personal walk with the Lord. And it's probably an obvious thing to say, isn't it? But the closer you are to the Lord in the difficult times, the better you can cope. So I think before trying to sort out the problems outside, perhaps, is to look deep inside and see how we are with the Lord.
Brilliant. Thank you. I remember I was talking to a colleague of mine, I think it was a couple of years ago now. He was heading for a Christian conference, and he was preparing for some work. And so I said, "How are you doing?" He said, "I'm really, really stressed out." So I said, what are you doing? What are you talking about? He said, "I'm talking about stress." So, yes. Why don't you turn your Bible to Zephaniah chapter 1. Zephaniah 1, and I'll read my Bible. Listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me and answer me. My thoughts trouble me, and I am distraught. That's Psalm 55 I'm reading from. I can never find Zephaniah either. I can never find that book. I swear somebody moves it every time I want it. I'm in Psalm 55. I thought you might want the practice. This is Psalm 55. And I can help you with Psalm 55. It's very easy to find in your Bible. It's just after Psalm 54. Okay, center of your Bible, more or less, down the middle. Psalm 55. This is David. And I just read the first couple of verses. That's the text we have been asked to hang our anxieties around, if you like, this afternoon. And we will do that together. Now, don't forget, a couple of times I'm going to ask you just to pitch in together to do a little work yourself as the time goes on. We have about 2 or 3 hours to spend together, so you'll have lots of time to. Right. Now, anxiety is actually a part of the fallen world, isn't it? And I think we do ourselves well to remember that. One of the huge conspiracies which causes incredible anxiety both in and outside of church, and I speak as someone who had professional counseling experience in the probation context for about 12 years, as well as the pastoral work I've been involved with for over a number of years. One of the causes of anxiety and intensified stress is when we actually don't give ourselves permission to recognize that it is actually a part of everyday life. It's a part of the consequence of the fall, as we've been hearing during the course of this week. The group REM did a tune, "Everybody Hurts Sometime," and that's true. And it's just helpful to remember that as an anchor for our thoughts. C.S. Lewis once put it this way: try to exclude the possibility of suffering which the order of nature and the existence of free will involve, and you find that you have excluded life itself. You just cannot circumnavigate, you cannot get around the idea that sometime or other, you, someone close to you, will find themselves under some element of anxiety or stress. The other thing to remember is this: it comes in very many forms. If you ever read 1984, George Orwell's book, you remember that there is a part in it which talks about Room 101. This is Winston and Julia, who were the sort of dissident in the brave new world, which George Orwell describes in that rather horrifying totalitarian description of society. And where these two people have gone off and committed adultery, eventually they're caught and taken to this Room 101, basically in the penal Department of Correction. Actually, they call it the Department of Love, Ministry of Love. And they're introduced to Room 101, and Room 101 is described as the most horrific place ever. The thing about Room 101 was this: Room 101 could, for you, be having your fingernails pulled out. For you, it could be rats. For somebody else, it could be the light switched off and being left in total darkness. Room 101 represented what was for the individual the most horrific thing. And for each of us, that may be a very different experience. When stress or anxiety or the pressures of life crowds in upon us, one of the most debilitating and defeating things is when we feel that the thing we are coping with is the only problem in the whole wide world, and everybody else is fine apart from poor us. And somehow we have isolated ourselves in our private pain, cut ourselves off from the rest of humanity, and not recognize that maybe the other person who is looking really relaxed and smiling away at you is also themselves experiencing their own type of stress. So stress, anxiety is a part of what it means to live the kind of lives we're living, the speed we're living it at, and so on. So for some folks here, it may be the anxiety of what you do in your senior years. It may be financial concerns about security. It may be about the grandchildren. It may be about the children who haven't quite done it the way you've trained them to do it. It may be about unemployment. It may be about the fact that you've worked in one place for a number of years and now you have been laid off and you are having to find a new lifestyle altogether, and so on and so forth. So it comes to each of us in different ways. Now, I love the Psalms. How many folks here would join me in that accolade of the book of Psalms? Now, I wonder why it is that we really appreciate the book of Psalms. This is where you can do your first brief exercise for me. Can I give you just 2 or 3 minutes to meet together in small groups, just huddle around in small groups of, say, 50 or so. No, do it smaller, 4 or 5 is better, and ask the question, why is the book of Psalms so engaging? Why do you love it? Why do you love Psalms? 3 minutes and then I'll stop you. Go. I don't know if you're used to it. Watch me. I would talk more slowly, and I think maybe the sound isn't so good. I will ask. I will ask. I will ask. Okay, 30 seconds. Time up. My watch works very fast. All right, can you hear me at the back? Somebody just asked if I would ask that. Not very well, okay. So maybe the combination of the sound people and myself, we will get it slightly better. And I wondered why you were gazing at me like that. I thought you were just enraptured. You're sitting there thinking, what is that bloke saying? And I'm thinking you're there full of admiration. Okay, we'll try and get the balance better so I don't stress you out. Now, shout at me and I will say it back for the recording's sake. Put your best preaching voice on and shout. The Lord is my shepherd. So you like this 23rd Psalm. Well, honest. The Psalms are honest. You can relate to the psalmist. Relevant to today. I will do it with the actions. Relevant to failings and praise for today. One more over here. Right. The psalmist is not afraid to tell God what he's feeling. I think you've all read my notes. Let's just close at this point this week. God describes David as a person after his own heart. But when you look at at David, and of course we know David didn't write all of the Psalms, he was a humongous failure in many things he did. David would not have won Best Daddy's Prize of the Year, or even the decade. He was a disaster in terms of a father. He wasn't always the best king. And frankly, when we go all hot and cold about some of the things Prince Charles gets up to, or has gotten up to, and the rest of the royal family, you put David up next to them, and their sins pales into insignificance when you think of what he got up to with Bathsheba. Did you hear about that story? Think what the news of the world would make of that. But David is still someone who comes through to us because of all the things you have said a while ago. Much of the Psalms, those written by David and others written by other individuals, fit in with those criteria, the reasons why we appreciate the Psalms. He was a transparent man. You get the feeling that David, even though he was, the top man, was also the kind of person you could actually sit down and have a cup of something with, don't you? It's like, I preached at a church here, St. Cuthbert, some time ago. And I'd never heard of St. Cuthbert, but I remember doing a radio interview sometime afterwards. Somebody was asking me where I was, and I said, I was at St. Cuthbert's. And St. Cuthbert's just sounds nice to me. It sounds like the sort of saint I could have a cup of tea with. He just sounds like a nice bloke. There is something about David which is accessible to us. An imperfect man, a man who was often hurting, and as somebody over here said, was not afraid to express what he was feeling. And that's how he starts off in this psalm. Listen to my prayer, O God, Psalm 55. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me. Answer me. There's a passion here, isn't there? This isn't a laid-back laissez-faire. This is almost David saying, I want to have a word with you, God, and I want you to give me some answers now. There was a desperation. There was a passion here which is not held back. And sometimes our prayers, our passions don't have to be long either, do they? Remember when I was in my final year of London Bible College, a very small group of us were walking around the football pitch on the morning of one of our finals. And one of my colleagues, a man called Alistair Begg, who some of you will know, four of us walking around the pitch. And just outside the football pitch, we stopped to offer up a prayer before the exam. And Alistair's prayer went like this. Dear Lord, help, he said. You all identified with that. Sometimes it's out of that passion that we should be prepared to come to God. This is not necessarily a place for complaint, is it? And let's not forget that throughout the Bible, there were characters who explained their anger, their frustration with God. Jonah did. Remember the story of Jonah, who God sent out, and Jonah thought God did him a really bad deal and really got very argumentative with God. Job did. When Job has almost passed his patience, and towards the end of the book, Job says, I want to have a word with you. Elijah had pretty much the same complaint. All of these people, touched by stress, were able to speak out the situation which confronted them. One of my favorite characters in this respect is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is always a fascinating fellow, isn't he? You wouldn't guess that he was the man who wrote New Every Morning, are your mercies. Because it's the same man who cries out in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 20, Oh Lord, you deceived me, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. What anguish. I am ridiculed all day long. Everybody mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out, proclaiming violence and destruction. Exactly the same frame of mind. People who understood that when stress or anxiety hit them, they were actually allowed to cry out to God. One of the issues about stress is that it becomes very important to admit it if it's happening. How many of us know individuals who, as we say, bottle everything up? And I know it's the obvious thing to say. I know there may well be individuals in this very building right now for whom The exercise of expressing what you feel is the most difficult thing in the world. People look at you and say, my, how cool you are. My, you never crack. My goodness, you are a strong girl. How you handle all of this and still break out in a smile on a Monday morning, I will never know. But you know, don't you? You know it's a cost, because perhaps it's not so much a strength as a repression. And that's absolutely not the way to handle it. Princess Diana, in a meeting I was present at, she was dedicating a building, opening a building, said something which I'll never forget. She said, in our society, there is what she described as a curious conspiracy to suppress tears. A curious conspiracy to suppress tears. If I had £1 for every person in professional or pastoral ministry I have said this to, I'd be a very wealthy person. But here is a line again, even if it is stating and starting at the obvious. If you are hurting, be prepared to say so. And be prepared to admit stress or anxiety to God as well. Because God doesn't count it against you. Can you remember that? God doesn't hold it against you. And there's a big, big difference between people who are just arrogant and abusive to God and people who are crying out because they're under such stress or tension or anxiety that they say so. David began by saying so. God won't punch you in the head if you say you are hurting and you want an audience with him. And then David, in his cry, continues by identifying the things which were hurting him. Have a look at the verses which follow from 2b into verse 5. My thoughts trouble me, I am distraught at the voice of the enemy, at the stares of the wicked, for they bring down suffering upon me and revile me in their anger. Those are very strong words. Bring down suffering upon me is like saying they dumped on me. They just dumped on me. And he goes on in that vein. My heart is in anguish, verse 4, within me. The terrors of death assail me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. Boy, this man is in mega stress. Some very strong words here. Distraught, troubled, anguish, overwhelmed. So here's the second principle we need to note. Liberate ourselves, number one, to express to God or others the fact that we are not coping, that we are not doing well, that we are under pressure, that we are under stress. Allow the alarm bell to go off in God's presence and in the presence of those to whom you are accountable or those with whom you live or have a close relationship. Here's a second from the text we just read, from 2b to 5. Talk about the symptoms. Say what's wrong if you can, but at least begin to find words to express what you feel. And David has used some very, very strong words here. I've been dumped on. And the whole reasoning here is he wants to try and talk about what the problem is. Now, I remember, folks, there's a young woman who was so much in denial. Her mother had died, and she hadn't spoken about this for a very, very long time. And it was very difficult for her to actually engage with that. We spent hours together until one day she somehow found the freedom to begin to articulate her feelings about the fact that her mother had died. It was almost as if there was a kind of liberating moment as she began to find the vocabulary to talk about what she was feeling. So the second thing is, try to find the vocabulary to speak about the stress, the anxiety, the pressure points, the pain. So don't lock it away. Begin to find the vocabulary for doing so. Because it's only as we begin to do that, that our capacity to actually handle the stress we feel can actually receive any healing. When I was in probation training back in the early 70s, I remember the word we used to talk about so often, it actually used to get on my nerves a little. How do you feel? See, it's a very non-rational, totally subjective word, isn't it? What are you feeling at this point in time? And I must confess, there are times when I wanted to bang. It felt very mushy. But it's okay. There is a time to talk about what we feel. How many folks here, don't put your hands up, are into Homer Simpson, I wonder? Now, I know that it's a very controversial family. It's a cartoon family, if you haven't seen it. It's an American cartoon family. They're actually pretty cynical about church and cynical about many of the values we will hold. But I sometimes think that the Simpsons, I would include the Simpsons amongst some of the best social commentary on life I have come across anywhere, and I'd be prepared to stand up and be pelted for saying that. But the last one I watched, because I'd been weaned off it, I have to confess that I only really got into The Simpsons because my son made me do it. He watched, and he kept saying, "Dad, you must watch this." So, you know how it is, you have teenage children, you just have to drift along for preaching purposes, you understand, to good illustrations. Anyway, I had been weaned off The Simpsons for a while, and I hadn't seen this thing for a long time. And then last week, I think it was, I was watching Homer Simpson trying to help Ned, his Christian neighbor who he can't stand, come through a particular stressful and psychiatric condition. They had Ned, this very weedy kind of person, trying to admit what was wrong, and Homer tried everything on him. You know, "I'm going to bed with your wife." And Ned would say, "Oh, that's good, fine, yeah, okay." And then go through a whole list of things trying to get Ned to identify what the problem was, until finally Ned admitted that his problem was he couldn't stand the post office. Now, it was a very, very silly thing to actually put on TV. But the point here was, something which may be very simple was the problem. It wasn't the big things, it was something which was really quite simple. He didn't like the way they operated at the post office. And that's what started him off and ended him up in a psychiatric ward. Well, you know, so we're doing okay, most of us, aren't we, in comparison to Ned? So let's be able to identify, find the words to be able to do this. Let me encourage you to do something else. Can you think about writing them down? What are you feeling? What's going on around you? Just brainstorm, write them down. You would be amazed at the power of words written down. There was a mother and a son who came to see me regularly back in my days when I used to be a probation officer, and they had a terrible relationship. He would abuse her verbally at every given opportunity. I have never in all my life heard a child speak so totally disrespectfully to their parent, ever. And this boy had been telling his mother this for, you know, just umpteen visits they made to my office. And then one day, I went to a whiteboard and I drew a line down the middle. And I said, "Okay, Mum, I want you to tell me all the things you are feeling about your son." And she told me, "Disappointed, sometimes he's disobedient, he annoys me, he causes me stress, he hurts my feelings, da-da-da-da." And then I said to her son, "Okay, now tell me all the things you were feeling about your mom." And he told me, and they were all expletives. It was just so ugly. And I can still see her face now as her eyes were transfixed on this whiteboard, because she saw the words she'd been hearing for months, if not years. For the first time, she saw them written down, and she was in total shock. Why? Because the reality had come in stark relief. Or take another young man, a couple whose marriage were under severe pressure, and they couldn't really figure out why. Before, he had what was, I guess, an unprofessional job, if one can use those kind of categories. And then he went away to study. He got a degree, and he went back to the same company, and now was doing a rather more skilled job. And now what was happening was his children were getting older, their needs were changing in relation to himself, his needs were changing in relation to his wife, neither of them could actually get a handle on this. And he hadn't taken into account that he had changed intellectually, he had changed socially, he had changed in terms of his own needs as a husband. She wasn't able to actually handle that. He was coming up for the age of 40, and you know what they say about 40. And then I said to him, have you ever thought about identifying where the stress is coming from in your marriage? He said, not really. So as we chatted, an hour later, he began to draw up words identifying stress points. I said to him, please go away and write it down. Now, I have to tell you the truth. I'm not quite sure where that's got them to, but the last time I heard from one of them and from my wife, I hear it's slightly better. Not perfect, but slightly better. Why? Because somebody had taken time to begin to articulate the things they felt. The things they felt. Words, ladies and gentlemen, are very important in the healing process and in the coping mechanisms of handling anxiety or stress, wherever those anxieties or stress may be coming from. Let me give you one last example. This young man had committed murder. It was partly accidental. It was his girlfriend. This goes back a few years as well. I remember this fella coming to me, and it was really quite important because he came to see me in the office week after week, and he always came with a cap on, dark glasses, and black leather gloves. It was really quite, all very symbolic. And whenever we attempted to talk about the offense, which was obviously still affecting him quite dramatically, even after he had been released from prison, he found it totally impossible. And then one day, when he came to see me, this is about a year after we were working together, I said to him, one day you're going to have to begin to try to articulate what you are feeling. And he looked at me and he said, do you want me to talk? I said, well, yeah, Jim, if you're ready. His name wasn't Jim, if you feel that's right. Now what he did was very symbolic. He took off his hat, he took off his glasses, he took off his gloves, and he spoke for 2 hours non-stop. He just spoke about his feelings, described the events, went into the details, left no detail unuttered, it seemed. 2 hours solid. I remember sitting there, wanting to go to the loo, thinking, I better cross my leg or something, I just can't leave. This man is just unburdening. Let's try to ask God, and if you need somebody else, somebody you feel safe with, somebody who you know won't laugh at you, somebody who is empathetic, somebody who has a vested interest in your development, to find the vocabulary. It's really very important to know how to do that. And sometimes it takes time. And often, can I be extremely practical? Often you can tell, can't you? It's almost like you get stuck here, isn't it? That sort of feeling. Worth making the effort. And if you need someone professionally to help to do that, then seek that. Sometimes the best person is not the vicar, the parson, or the pastor. And sometimes the best person is not your spouse. Sometimes that best person is a Christian counselor or someone who is professionally equipped to help us to make that very important journey. Now, that's really important. But let me say something which is equally important, if not much more important, and it's this. Symptoms are not causes. Really important. One of the things I consistently stumbled across was that people didn't always tell you straight off what the problem was. In fact, the art of counseling is listening to what people don't say. It's hearing what people are not telling you in the first instance. It's coming at the issues related to stress in our lives very often as a secondary step, a secondary part of our development in the coping process. And to some extent, there are shades of this in how David comes at it. Jump down to verse 12. Am I in the right place in my notes? Yeah. If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were raising himself against me, I could hide from him. But it's you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship as we walked with the throng at the house of God. Verse 20, my companion attacks his friends. He violates his covenant. His speech is as smooth as butter, yet war is in his heart. His words are more smoothing than oil, yet they are drawn sword. You see that? That's the problem. He doesn't start with that. He actually cries out to God, and then he talks about his feelings. I am distraught. I am troubled. I am anguished. I'm overwhelmed. But the symptoms are not the problems. It is very important to find a route into what the problem is. Sometimes, when I am stressed, I literally have to sit down and ask myself, why? Really? And to walk back over the last hour or 2 or 3 or 4, the last day, until I hit it. Oh, that's it. Now, I may be just wired up very different from most of you, but that's just how it works for me sometimes. There's just an incredible restlessness. You know, I'm on edge, I'm fidgety, I'm totally unrelaxed, I can't settle. And then I have to just say, well, what is going on? Is it that I'm busy? Maybe not. Is it that my wife won't let me have any spending money this week? Maybe not. Is it that I didn't like what I just saw on TV? No. Is it that I haven't done the sermon preparation yet? No. And then I sit and I really take time to ask myself, what is wrong? Why art thou cast down, and O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Psalm 42. What's wrong with you, soul? What's really going on? That's the question. What's really wrong? How many of you have children or people who depend on you, and they come in a huff, and then you listen to this whole barrage of stuff about this, that, t'other, and then you say, okay, what's going on? And then there's an awful silence for about, a whole 30 seconds, and the whole mood changes. They take a deep breath. They come from the third lane into the lay-by, and then they talk. And most of us, if we troubled ourselves, would find out where the stress really lies. With David, it was a friend, somebody who hurt him deeply. So here is the lesson. Invariably, when we are terribly stressed, it may have to do with human relationships. Very often, it's with human relationships. Yes, we're busy. There are not enough hours in the day. The kids are demanding, etc., etc. The job's not going well, or we've just lost it, or we've just started a new one and we're anxious about it. We've just come back from the doctor and the prognosis is not good, etc., etc. But the important thing is to really pull in and ask, what is the cause of my pain? David said, it's a relationship. My good buddy has dumped on me, deceived me. Now, this is more than a drift, isn't it? This is more than a drift in relationships. How many of you have friends who you used to be really close with? It's the kind of thing which happens a lot in teenage years. You're somebody you are really tight with, and then you grow in different directions, and you see them 3 years later, you say, oh, what's your Jane? Hiya, Jean. How are you doing? Oh, fine. So how's your mom then? Oh, she's good. And how's your dad then? Oh, he's all right. And how's the job then? Oh, it's great. See ya. Bye. And you drifted. Maybe it was natural. This is very different. This is a friend who put the dagger in, who really hurt David. And so finally, after the crying out, after the recognition of the symptoms, and verbalizing feelings, he says, here's the problem. My friend duffed me in. Let's be bold enough. Let's be honest enough to recognize, where is the stress? Is it that I have to take personal responsibility of sitting with someone and looking at my diary so that I manage well, because I'm spending all my time trying to prove to everybody else in my house that I am really, really together, or that I, whatever. That I've got to stop proving myself to other people. Is that where the stress is? Interesting, I just looked at the newspapers today. Michael Portillo is saying, thank God I've lost, now I can be myself. You kind of wonder, well, whoa, he's on. And are we pushed and stressed by the tyranny of other people's expectation? Are we being stressed to climb the economic ladder to keep up with somebody else? Is that the real issue? If it is, let's then deal with the real issue. But let's take time to get there. Okay, so David cries out, he articulates his feelings as best he can, but then he calms down, and the real passion comes out. My best friend deceived me. What's his response to all of this? Well, here's some how not to do it. First, escapism is not the answer for our difficulties. I said, oh, that I had the wings of a dove, verse 6. I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and the storm. Escapism. Time out. I often hear people talking about time out. Christians are into time out. Time out. Got to take some time out from church, time out from God. And very often all they do is they take their stress in their time out because they really haven't gotten down to the root of the issue. Escapism is really not the answer to our difficulties. Working more is not the answer to our stress. I was talking to a very good friend just very recently who came very close to really dysfunctioning and in fact had to take some time off. And what had happened was some domestic difficulties, death of a relative, all kinds of expectations gathered upon him, and he thought the best way of dealing with stress was to work harder. I must work, I must work, I must work. And how often have we spoken to people whose marriage is on the rocks or whose children are going through a tough time, and their answer, their equation is work longer. And here is a very good question for us. If the stress is happening within our homes, the greatest temptation is to leave it, to flee, to stay away from it as long as possible. And I want to give you a small clue. If there's been difficulties in your home and you suddenly find yourself or your spouse or your children leaving earlier and coming home later, begin to ask some questions of yourself or them, because it could be that investing more time away from the home is just another escape hatch which we use. Sometimes it's substance abuse. Yes, substance abuse. It's alcohol, it's drugs for many people outside in the world. And sometimes for us in the church, it is acceptable medication. Rather than handling the reasons, we escape through the easy hatch of medication. But neither is the route we should be taking. Let me just read you a little something. In such circumstances, people may be shocked to discover that as in any other relationship, it is perfectly possible to be angry with God and to love him at the same time. I'm going back a little bit here in our thoughts, really. All of us know that the right response is a response of faith, which defies the odds, puts our trust in God's ability to help us. And most of us start in this way, and invariably it works. But occasionally, we run into intractable problems which refuse to go away with the first few prayers. And when our faith is tested over long periods, we may progress to a level of tolerance, apparent acceptance and coping that may look to everyone else like faith. We may at that point be the only ones who know differently. Eventually, though, we become trapped, feeling that God has let us down, but that we are not allowed to say so. And the private anger builds up in the secrecy of our brave new world of pretense. At such a time, we may ask for time out from our commitments and begin wondering how much longer we can keep up the charade of belief. We drift along like holed vessels, sinking quietly as we go with the flow. These are the times when our faith has reached the point at which it is unable to replenish itself. Often at the place of exasperation, our groanings are no longer towards God. They become entirely centered on our own need to be freed from pain itself. That's the silent place of escapism which goes on for many Christians in the average church. And escapism is not the answer. Neither is the answer to go over the top. Here's what David gets up to in that moment of frantic response. Verse 10, day and night they prowl about on its walls. Malice and abuse are within. Destructive forces are at work in the city. Threats and lies never leave its streets. There may be a note of benevolence in this, that he's somehow seen his pain. Some commentaries would suggest that. He has suddenly moved from the privatization of his own pain and he's into the pain of the city. I'm not so sure. I think it was just David over the top myself. Like, for example, Jeremiah. Let's go back to that chapter in Jeremiah chapter 20. Because this is Jeremiah complaining against God. And this is how he gets on with it. Cursed be the day I was born. May the day my mother bore me not be blessed. Listen to this. Cursed be the man who brought my father the news, who made him very glad, saying, a child is born to you. May that man be like the towns the Lord overthrew without pity. May he hear wailing in the morning, a battle cry at noon, for they did not kill me in the womb. So when Jeremiah gets really vexed with God, he's taking it out on everybody. Even the poor bloke who brought the news about his birth gets it in the neck. And ladies and gentlemen, this is not the way to cope with stress. We are not meant to walk around like bears with sore heads. We're actually meant to be people who find another alternative route. The place of rest, therefore, is a different place. Now, this is your last little exercise you're going to do, and then I'm going to be closing. We will close by 3:30. Psalm 55, verse 22 to 23. In those little groups again, will you read that? And then let's ask, what is David's final response? You may want to just read this by yourself or with one other person. Just read it really quickly together. Psalm 55, verse 22 and 23. And this is the positive note we're closing on. 2 minutes, and I'm going to stop you, and I'm going to come back for the last 2 minutes just to close off. Let's go. Psalm 55, verse 22 and 23. Great to see this crash Bible course going on. Another half minute I'll give you. Okay, I wonder what you came up with. They are to some extent the obvious things, and there is an extent to which I have deliberately not spent too much time on them and sort of tried to clear away some of the rubble in terms of our responses before getting here. But see if you came close to the things I'm seeing from this text, or indeed if I'm coming close to the things you saw. Very briefly, David said that he would cast his cares, or he invited us to cast our cares on the Lord, for he sustains us. Not an easy thing to do. Nobody should pretend that's an easy thing to do, because the easiest thing is to pick them up again. But it's the extent to which we are truly convinced that God genuinely cares, and it's the extent to which our faith in God truly exercises itself in the adverse circumstances, the stresses, the realities of everyday situation, that a text like this will actually come home as true in our lives. Casting our cares on God is something we will have to do time and again in prayer. It is something we will have to do as time and again we make space to do that in God's presence. And that's the difference between running away and taking time in God's presence. There's just a world of difference between escaping somewhere and allowing space in our lives, slowing things down, cutting things out of our diaries. It may mean not turning up for church that Wednesday, actually. It may mean not picking up somebody else's burden. I met a woman in Sainsbury's, really stressed out. What's wrong with you? Everybody wants me to be strong for them, and the church is falling to pieces, and I'm going to pieces. And I said, please look after yourself and take space to survive. Have you ever noticed, if you get on a plane, when they're going through the safety drill, they will tell you, if the oxygen supply fails, oxygen masks will come out above your head. If you have a dependent or a child, put your mask on first and then help the other person. You've got to survive to help somebody else survive. So this casting our cares on God may sometimes literally mean taking time to allow God to take our cares, because he doesn't always grab them from us and run away and have us chasing after him to get them back. It has to be a two-way thing where we give them up to God, and very often we have to keep doing that in many instances. And we do that to the extent that we really become convinced that God takes care of business. But you, O God, verse 23, will bring down the wicked into the pit of corruption. Bloodthirsty and deceitful men will not live out half their days. Not just vindictiveness. This is David's way of saying, look, my best mate duffed me up, but you will take care of business. On a very personal note from me, here is my personal rule for life. I want to live my life in such a way that there isn't one person on the planet who I cannot look at and smile at. That's how I want to live my life. That there's nobody I have to cross the street to avoid. That I may hug you even if you find it rather annoying. That's how I want to live. And can you think of a life which is lived knowing that whatever you do to me, and I could tell you some stories, God takes care of business. And that vengeance doesn't belong to us. Most human stress comes from an inability to recognize that God is the God of tomorrow and that he takes care of his own. And that's both in terms of personal and interpersonal relationships, as much as the circumstances which comes at us, comes to us, and threatens to overwhelm us. The extent to which I know that God is in control of the world and the circumstances, anything from infertility to unemployment and a divorce and wayward children or a failed exam or a sweetheart, who turned out to belong to somebody else. That somehow God has the ability to take care. And finally, David said, I will put my trust in you. But as for me, I trust in you. Now, if you want anti-stress, that's it. I put my trust in you. Let me tell you what I've done in my Bible. I've slightly desecrated it because as I looked at that text, I had to put one addition because I think that's what David meant. I've put, as for me, I trust in you. And then in brackets I've written, not him. I think what David was saying. My best mate let me down. I'm not going to put my trust there in the same way I'm trusting you, because you won't let me down. So I think I hear David saying, I'm not going to trust that bloke anymore. I'm going to trust you. You're not going to let me down. I am going to trust you. That's a secret, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't mean we don't have any confidences. We trust no one. We look at everybody over our shoulders. But it means our primary point of trust, the place to which we cast our burdens and our cares, not just in preacher speak, but in the disciplines of our lives, is God himself. The stress-free God who is able to succor and support those who put their trust in him. You still look like you're awake. God bless you. I'm going to pray. I thought Trish was coming back. Father, thank you for your grace. Thank you for your love. You are such an incredible God, and you take care of business. We ask today, for those of us to whom this word has been specifically applicable, that you would give us the tools of honesty and courage and transparency to take hold of what your word has said to us. There may be those today, Lord, who will now need to go and talk with someone in the pastoral and counseling team. Please give them the courage to step out of their silence. Please give us the courage to step back to situations with our wives and our husbands, our children, our siblings, where we must now put things right. Please give us the courage to go back to our diaries and to allow your grace to rule our lives and not the business of our culture. Give us what we need so that at the end of our lives, people will look at us and say, she put her trust in God. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Have a nice day.